Um, we'll start with Jessica. I'm just going to make a brief introduction. She's the Fair Housing and Policy Director of the Chautauqua Housing Authority. So she's going to be talking about history of discrimination and fair housing law. So take it away there, Jess.
Okay, I'm going to share my screen here.
Everyone, please mute.
If you, I don't know how you normally do this, but how would you like me to answer questions? Do you normally wait until the end of the presentation, or can participants ask questions throughout? Mom, you're on mute.
Everybody put it in the chat, okay, if you have a question. And Lisa will be able to see that.
Okay, perfect. And then, yeah, then I can answer. Well, and so then Lisa will just read the questions at the end?
Yes.
Okay. I mean, it's also fine to interject throughout. I mean, it might be helpful if it's, you know, however you guys want to do it. Okay, so again, I'm Jessica Mallon. I'm the Director of Fair Housing and Policy with the Chicago Housing Authority. So I primarily oversee fair housing for our housing choice voucher holders in the city of Chicago, but also weigh in with our public housing units and project-based vouchers as well. So what I'm going to do is for second, I am not an attorney, so none of this is any sort of legal advice when it comes to fair housing. But this is just to kind of give you an overview of the law as it exists now and how it kind of came into place. So the Fair Housing Act was voted into law in 1968 and was added to the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And part of the impetus for this law was the assassination of Martin Luther King. So this was signed into law under President Johnson. Now, when the act was originally written, you could not discriminate on the basis of race, color, sex, religion, or national origin. In 1988, the Fair Housing Act was amended to add familial status and disability. Now, these are two really important areas, and I'm going to talk a little bit about disability at the end, because that is a huge area of discrimination in housing. We often think about housing discrimination being more related to race or national origin or color, but people with disabilities face a lot of discrimination when looking for housing. And then familial status is discrimination against a family with a child under the age of 18. And this is a huge area, as well, as many landlords tell, renters, I don't want children in my unit. So then I'm actually in Illinois. I'm sure, as you could guess by the fact that I work for the Chicago Housing Authority. So I'm not that knowledgeable about any additional protected classes in New York, but it's important to know that there are additional protected classes under state, county, and municipal law. So like here in Chicago, we have additional protected classes for ancestry, sexual orientation, gender identity, marital status, military discharge status, and source of income. Now, being that I work at the Chicago Housing Authority, source of income is a huge, and I know that you were just talking earlier about affordable units, but source of income is a huge, huge area of discrimination as well. Here in Chicago, we see a lot of landlords that refuse to take vouchers. And so, but that is illegal here. And so someone who's told that they don't take a voucher or they don't want to participate in the program, they are violating the city of Chicago fair housing law, as well as Cook County's fair housing law. Now, it's different from municipality or jurisdiction to jurisdiction because some jurisdictions do have source of income discrimination, but it excludes housing choice vouchers. So those are the protected classes currently under the law. Now, in a fair housing update in February, the House voted to pass the Equality Act, which would expand federal protections for LGBTQ people by prohibiting discrimination based on gender identity and sexual orientation. So this would amend the Fair Housing Act and add gender identity and sexual orientation to the current law. Now, there are fair housing advocates who have done some litigation regarding sexual orientation under the fact that sex is covered under the law. So when you, for example, you have a gay couple, looking for housing and they're discriminated against, it has been used that one partner or the other was discriminated against because they were the same sex as the other partner. So what are some of the things that are prohibited under the Act? Refusing, now this is probably one of the most basic ones, refusing to rent a unit because of a person's protected status. So again, a property manager or owner telling an applicant they don't accept teenagers in their building. Now the second one I probably should have taken out of my slide because I don't know if vouchers are or source of income is a protected class in your area, but it is here. Imposing different terms or conditions because of a person's protected status. So this we see a lot in the voucher program where a landlord will require voucher holders to pay a different security deposit, or they ask for additional rent on top of the actual voucher when market rate tenants aren't paying the same amount for similar units. Now, and I just want to clarify, I primarily deal with fair housing in terms of the rental market, but this does apply to purchasing homes as well and lending. And I'll get into that in just a second. And also just to back up for a second, the law does cover private market housing. There are small exemptions under the federal law that allow for, I think if it's 3 or 4 units and one of the units is landlord occupied, they're not covered. There's exemptions for religious organizations. But here, because of our city ordinance, all private housing is covered. So another thing that's prohibited is making discriminatory statements or publishing discriminatory communications. So, and this can be, you think of discriminatory communication or statements and you think of, outright saying, I don't want a certain protected class to live here. But it can be, intent is irrelevant. So if you say, an ad that said Christian owner seeks same for rental unit, or passing out flyers that say senior home for people with an active lifestyle. Now that, that is something that you wouldn't necessarily attribute, because you can have senior housing if it receives certain types of fundings. But the fact that it says active lifestyle could be a deterrent maybe for someone with a disability who wouldn't feel necessarily comfortable living there. And then a landlord or property manager or realtor states this is a senior building, we don't want any children living here. In most senior buildings, it just has to be the head of household. That's that has to be a senior. They can have children residing with them. And using advertisements with only human models of one racial or national origin segment of the population. So if any of you are property managers, you want to make sure that if you are advertising your unit, you are using diverse people to advertise it. So what is prohibited? Lying about the availability of a dwelling because of a person's protected status. So this is a really interesting area because as a prospective buyer or tenant, you wouldn't necessarily know if that owner or landlord or property manager is telling you something different than what they're telling somebody else. So this with this, telling someone that a unit is available versus telling someone of a protected class that a unit isn't available, the way that a lot of this is uncovered is through fair housing testing. And I'm going to talk about that in just a second because that's a really important component of uncovering discrimination under the law. It's also prohibited to retaliate against someone for filing a fair housing complaint. So as a landlord or an owner, anybody has the right to file a fair housing complaint. It's up to your jurisdiction to determine whether or not they're going to take the case and whether or not they're going to investigate it. But anybody can file a complaint for any reason. But it's illegal for any sort of property manager or landlord to retaliate against you if you do file a complaint. Now, this is a really this is another area where, again, intent is irrelevant under the law. So steering applicant, which is illegally guiding renters to a particular area based on the makeup of the building or the neighborhood. We see this a lot with landlords who say, well, this building, landlords with large portfolios say, this building is Section 8 approved. Well, there's no such thing as Section 8 approved. We do an individual assessment with each unit to make sure it passes inspection. And even in a fair housing testing project we did a few years ago, we definitely saw property managers dissuade people from coming into certain buildings because there was a large Chinese population there, or there was a large Russian population there, and they felt that they wouldn't be comfortable in that particular building. So this is another area that I think it is one of the reasons that the Fair Housing Act came into place to begin with, and that is for-profit persuade or try to persuade homeowners to sell their homes by suggesting that people of a particular protected characteristic are moving into the neighborhood. So this is what's called blockbusting. So developers and potential buyers who were buying up large numbers of units, especially in cities like Chicago, they would scare people, particularly white people, to say, well, there's a large number of Black people moving in, people of different national origins, and they're going to lower your property rates. You better get out while you can before your property value plummets. So that's called blockbusting, and that is illegal under the law, and it was something that was used by unscrupulous developers for a long time. So this is and one thing I also want to say, well, I'll get to this in a second. So in lending, so this is what's called redlining, and this was actually government policy. So this was not discrimination. This was our actual government saying, yes, lenders, you can do this. Yes, banks, you can do this. You can determine that certain areas of a city or wherever are not places that you should be providing money. And so this is the refusal to make a mortgage loan or provide other financial assistance for a dwelling, refusal to provide information regarding loans, impose different terms or conditions, discriminate in the appraisal, and condition the availability of a loan on a person's response to harassment, refuse to purchase a loan. Now, it's important to note that even though this is illegal, this still happens. It still happens in minority neighborhoods, and it still happens to buyers of color. And there have been several, studies done recently that show as much. And then, I mean, I'm sure you're all well aware of the mortgage crisis, around 2008, and a lot of that predatory lending was for people of color. So it does continue to this day, and there are still, lawsuits going on that allege that owners and banks and lending agencies do these types of things. So one thing I really wanted to make sure that, I think it's really important to know, is that once disability was added to the Fair Housing Act, there was a lot of changes. So not only is housing that was built after, I can never remember the exact date. It was I think it's like 1990. They have to have, a certain number of accessible units or accessible features. Common areas need to be accessible. But one thing that's really important to understand about disability in housing is that, under all the other protected classes, you're discriminating if you treat someone differently. With disability, you're discriminating if you don't allow changes to your policies or changes to your buildings to allow a person with a disability to live there. So if homeowners, property managers, landlords need to allow people with disabilities to be able to request a reasonable accommodation in order to reside in that unit. One of the biggest areas involving this is assistance animals. Landlords can have pet policies that say, I don't allow pets in the building. That doesn't violate any fair housing law. What does violate fair housing law is if a person has an assistance animal and the landlord does not allow that assistance animal in the building. Assistance animals are not pets. They are assistance animals. And the thing that's different about the Fair Housing Act than other disability-related laws like the Americans with Disabilities Act is that the definition of assistance animal is very, very broad. I'm sure you've heard recently about airlines not allowing or limiting service animals on flights. Under the Fair Housing Act, snakes can be assistance animals. Miniature horses can be assistance animals. They can be there for emotional support. They could be there to detect seizures. There's numerous things that an assistance animal can be there for. So that's a huge area of litigation in terms of reasonable accommodation. So it's just something to remember. And then landlords also have to require tenants to make modifications if this is a rental situation. So if someone's in a wheelchair, a landlord would be required to let that person build a ramp, add grab bars in the bathroom. It would be the tenant that has to pay it, but the landlord would have to require it. And they can require them to return it back after the end of the rental term, but it is important to know that those modifications can be made. And I know I'm going over my time, so I will try to wrap this up quickly. And then, some of the other things you just see in terms of fair housing and discrimination. I don't know how familiar you are with the term NIMBY, which means not in my backyard. You see a lot of that with plans for affordable housing developments in certain neighborhoods. We see it in Chicago when there's plans for group homes or affordable housing. You go to, public comment hearings, and the vitriol that you hear is it's appalling. And then another thing with fair housing discrimination is that a lot of fair housing is a lot more known. And so people know what they can't say. So a lot of what we see in terms of housing discrimination when people report it to us is that it's done with a smile. It's not outright saying denial that someone can live there, but it's, well, I'm so sorry, you're a day late with we just rented the unit. And how we find that out is we actually do fair housing testing. So we, if you're not familiar with that, it's when you send two people out to view a unit, and one person they have all similar characteristics except one attribute or protected class. So you might send one white tester out and one black tester out. We might send a man out and a woman out. So to see if they're treated differently. And then you can actually use that information for enforcement purposes, for education purposes. So that's how we kind of, if you have a feeling that you are being discriminated against, but if a landlord tells you a unit's rented, I mean, what do you know if it's rented or not? So that's where fair housing testing comes in. And then the last thing is affirmatively furthering fair housing regulations. All jurisdictions who receive certain types of fundings have had a duty to affirmatively further fair housing under the original law, which means that it's not just about not discriminating, but it's actively working to desegregate communities. And so there were some lawsuits, I think, in the early 2000s about jurisdictions, because they have to provide information about what they're doing to deconcentrate and desegregate, but they weren't following through on these plans. And then under Obama, they updated the regulations and provided very specific rules about how to comply with affirmatively furthering fair housing. Those were rolled back under the Trump administration and were no longer required. So we'll see, what happens under this new administration. So, and then if you know of anyone who needs assistance in fair housing or feels that they've been discriminated against, they can, these are the numbers to contact HUD. And yet they have 1 year from the last violation. Okay, I see that there's a couple questions here. Can I just pull them up in the chat? Oh, okay, so Josiah said discrimination based on source of income is illegal in New York as well, which is good. The local penny saver has an ongoing ad seeking single, employed, or retired men to rent apartment. No. That all of that would be discriminatory. Now, yes, and the newspaper does have culpability when they run a discriminatory ad, so the penny saver could be held responsible. Now, there's been litigation with Craigslist. I don't know if that's a big way for people to look for housing in your area, but there was litigation as to whether or not Craigslist was responsible, since people were posting their own ads. And I think ultimately they found that Craigslist wasn't responsible, but newspapers are. So the penny saver could be held responsible for posting that particular ad in their newspaper. And now, depending if this is a private landlord, yes, I mean, and again, I don't know all the facts of the case, but I would just say, just looking at it would be discriminatory, but there are different, if it is some type of affordable housing or targeted housing that may, but I don't know, retired men, I don't know what type of housing that would be. But can you run a men only or women only boarding house? Again, that would depend. As a private landlord, you would, I don't know how you would be able to do that. You'd have to have what's called a business related reason, but I don't know what sort of business related reason you could have. Now, if you do, there are certain certain housing that is for like domestic violence survivors that could be for women, but I don't know that they could just limit it to women, but that's who the housing is targeted for. It gets complicated in terms of supportive housing because you can target certain populations for certain types of funding, but it can get, there's a lot of gray, well, not gray areas, but it can get confusing when you factor in fair housing. Okay, I apologize if I went over my time.
We appreciate your time, Jessica. And if you need to, sign off, that's great. We thank you very much. And why don't we go on to our next speaker? And you can stop your screen share. And we'll yes, go ahead.
I just want to say somebody posted it would be interesting to know how many complaints are actually won by the person filing the complaint and what are some of the penalties. You can go on HUD's website, and the thing is if the case is settled, you wouldn't necessarily be able to see what happened, but they do post information about the cases that are filed with them. And there are some of the cases, they'll post the specific information, and it does list what the penalties are if the landlord is found to discriminated.
Okay.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye, Mom.
Okay, so Josiah, you can go next as soon as Jessica gets off her screen share here. Okay, good. All righty, Josiah, would you like to go next and talk about homelessness?
Yeah, that sounds great. And it's great to be here with you, everyone, this afternoon. Usually we invite speakers from the League of Women Voters to some of our events, so it's great to have the opportunity to come and speak with you at your event.
Oh, thanks.
I have a presentation here on homelessness services. I'm the Director of Housing and Community Development with Chautauqua Opportunities, and some of the services that are provided here are COI services, but I also serve with the Chautauqua County Homeless Coalition. So I'm presenting also on behalf of all of our member agencies and the types of services that are provided throughout the county. What I'd like to do is just give an overview of the homelessness situation in our county, look at some data, talk about the services that are being provided, some of the needs that we have in the community, and then talk specifically about the situation with COVID and how we're dealing with that right now. So first of all, the last year that we have reporting numbers is ended in August of 2020. You can see that there were 777 individuals and 551 households that received homeless services. Majority of those, 72%, were between 18 and 61, slightly more men than women, and a small percentage transgender or gender nonconforming. You'll also note that the majority, about 80% of those who are homeless, are white. However, minorities are disproportionately affected. If you look at the population's demographics in general, African Americans specifically and Latinos are disproportionately affected by homelessness as well as poverty in general. A few other things to mention. First of all, is that 7% of those who are homeless are coming out of jail or prison or a detention facility of some kind. And so we know that there is a connection between homelessness and the jail population. Although someone coming out of jail should not be discharged to homelessness, we do see that happen if they don't have a very strong connection in the community when they're discharged. And then also, there is sort of this myth that those who are homeless don't have any income, but that's not always the case. we have about 46% of those locally do have a source of income and yet are still unable to afford housing. So that, I know those percentages don't exactly add up to 100%, but I think that's just a rounding error. So that's just a general overview of the last year's data. What I'd like to do is just explain the philosophy that goes into the homelessness services. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to work with those who are literally homeless on the left, move them into housing in the middle, and then to self-sufficiency on the right. And there's different programs, or I guess services, that we provide in order to assist with that. On the left side, you'll see our street outreach. So that's going out into the community, trying to find homeless individuals who might be living on the street, or living in a car, or living in a place unfit for human habitation. We also have those who are living in emergency shelters. And I'll go through some of those shelters on the next slide. The next step for those would be to help them to move into some form of housing. That could be a permanent housing option. Permanent supportive housing is typically for those with a mental illness or who have substance abuse disorder. We have several providers locally who work specifically with that population, and they're not required to have a term limit on how long they can live in that housing, but it's there to support them so that they do not fall back into homelessness. Secondly, we have some transitional housings that are time limited, but the folks who are going to those just need a little extra support for a period of time. However, the vast majority of those who are coming out of homeless are receiving services that we call rapid rehousing. And that means that they're going into a private apartment that is rented out to a private landlord. And we may be able to assist with helping with security deposit, first month rent, or some ongoing rent for a period of time. Typically, that's just for a few months until the household's able to afford it and be on their own again. And so once that's happened, we're able to exit someone from those programs using the acronyms there on the right, and they become self-sufficient. So that's our goal, is to sort of move folks wherever they are along from the left to the right in our services. And here you'll see the different service providers that we have throughout the county for these different services. Street outreach is something that Chautauqua Opportunities does. Emergency shelter. So, the UCAN City Mission in Jamestown is the men's shelter. The Salvation Army does provide a domestic violence shelter in Jamestown. COI has a few emergency houses for larger families. And the Chautauqua County Safe House that COI operates is a runaway and homeless youth shelter, again, down in Jamestown. So you'll see that some of those services specialize in specific populations, and some are more centered in Jamestown than they are in the northern part of the county. Those who are not fitting into any of those categories are served by the Department of Social Services and are typically placed in motels for the time that they're in emergency shelter. Transitional housing, the YWCA has some, and then COI has some youth as well as some family programs that offer transitional housing. And then permanent supportive housing, again, this is for those who typically have mental illness or substance abuse disorder. Recovery Options, Stell, and Evergreen. Those are the main providers of those services. Rapid rehousing, I would say that COI is the main provider, and then there is another provider that does that for veterans, which is called Soldier On. We also have some supportive services such as legal assistance, employment, and mental health association. These services are helping homeless individuals once they're housed in order to overcome some of the barriers they may face to maintaining their housing. As I mentioned, we are a homeless coalition, and Liz and the Housing Authority are one of our members. Most of those providers I all mentioned, they're all part of the homeless coalition. It's what HUD calls a local continuum of care. And so, in fact, we are an organization that has a constitution and a board of directors. We're a formal organization, and we're able to put in the applications to HUD as for funding for our local community and help to allocate those resources to the local community. So the continuum of care has an important role in connecting the homelessness services and allocating resources to homelessness services in the local community. So there are a few different needs in our community, but I would say the biggest need that we have right now is that there is no emergency shelter specifically for families or women with children, which is the largest need. As I mentioned, most are living in the motels where DSS places them. But there's a few things that are problematic about that. One is that most of those motels are outside of the cities where services are being provided. And so if you're needing to work with social services or COI in Jamestown, you're living in Faulkner. Or if you're needing to work in Dunkirk, then you're living in Pomfret. And without strong transportation, as those who are homeless usually have, it can be very time consuming just to receive the services. And let alone looking for housing where you're trying to live. So that's a bit of a gap. And we're trying to address that. COI has put an application into the state to develop a homeless shelter in Jamestown. The UCAN City Mission is also looking at a project that would help meet this gap. And we see that it's actually there could be a couple projects that would really help meet that need in the community. Secondly, we do have permanent supportive housing providers, but we don't have enough to meet the need of that population. So we could use more bed availability in Chautauqua County. Third, we do know that jail reentry services are a need and better connection so that those who are coming out of institutions have better options for housing. Right now they have typically are placed with other people in the community, but those are not, in every situation, they're not strong enough connections and people may fall into homelessness pretty quickly. And then we need more workforce or workforce development services that cater to the homeless population. Lastly, I just want to mention a little bit about the situation right now. We are in New York State in an eviction moratorium. There's a federal moratorium, but the more restrictive moratorium is the state's moratorium, which is expiring on May 1st. And so landlords are not able to evict tenants, and that's been going on for about a year. During that time, the positive has been that there's been a small decrease in homelessness. I don't want to say that we haven't seen any homelessness, because we certainly have, but it's been a small decrease from the amount of people who are being evicted. Or who are going into shelter. No one's being evicted, but those who are still, some are going to shelters. But there's also been a decrease in housing mobility. Fewer units are available because fewer people are being evicted. So the housing market is a little bit strained. We don't know exactly when the moratorium will be lifted. It could be lifted in May, it could be extended again. But in the meantime, that's putting a lot of pressure on landlords. Some are not receiving all of their rents. Some are not making all the repairs they need to maintain their property during this time. So that's a concern. We also have prevention funding, but we're not able to use that prevention funding while the courts are closed and are unable to formally evict someone. So a lot of resources are available once the moratorium has been lifted, and we expect that it could be a real tsunami of evictions that occur right at that time. And I will just say that in some cases, the hardships are increasing. And so we know that could lead to further evictions as well. And we have seen, in some cases, I would say a little less over the winter, but in the fall we saw quite a bit. We did see an increase in street homelessness. As I mentioned, there is an increased funding but it's only available until after the lifting of the moratorium. So that's my contact information. And then Scott is our homelessness services manager who's handling on the day-to-day basis our operations. So feel free to reach out to us if you have any other questions. And I guess I'll open it up to chat now, see if there's any questions.
I was going to unmute myself. I know that, what about the domestic violence where a woman and perhaps her children, there used to be some housing in, what is it, the Colburn building, but that was sold, right? And that's no longer available?
The only services are provided by the Salvation Army. They have the Anu Center in Jamestown. So that is, as far as I know, the only provider of those types of services, but there isn't anything North County.
Okay. Any other questions then? Well, again, thank you, Josiah. We appreciate your time and great talk. And housing for, does county have a housing first model?
Well, I'd say the Homeless Coalition, yes, we do have a policy that states that our member agencies have a housing first model, which means that we prioritize putting people in housing before we're looking at any other program requirements, like having income or having in some cases, substance abuse restrictions. So that is our policy of the Homeless Coalition, and our providers do conform to that. I can't say, I don't know if she meant by the county government by that. I couldn't speak for them specifically, but they're not really a housing provider. So I'd say yes, that's probably true in general because the housing providers are doing that.
Okay, and there was another question. If new houses on Main Street, I imagine, owned by Stell, does that mean all receive mental health services? Do you know?
I do know that that's not completely, not all of those housing are specifically designated for those with mental health services. I think they do have a small percentage of those, or maybe you want to say 10 out of the 40 some that are designated, but many of them are simply just affordable housing.
Okay, great. Okay, thank you. All righty. Well, thank you again, Josiah. It was great. We'll move on to Elizabeth Cardona, who is with the Dunkirk Housing Authority.
How are you doing? Can you hear me clearly? Can everyone hear me? Thank you. Thank you. So thank you, Josiah. And, as he stated, I'm just a small part of the opportunity for people to obtain permanent and affordable housing. As we spoke earlier before we got on the Zoom meeting, there just isn't enough. But we are able to fill some gaps. So the City of Dunkirk Housing Authority is public housing, similar to the Jamestown Housing Authority. I don't have a PowerPoint, but I do have a script. Mary, if you invite me again, I'll have a PowerPoint next time. They were fancy, but I'm more a talker, but they were very nice. So maybe Josiah can help me put one together. And so we have in the Housing Authority, all located in Dunkirk, 234 apartments. And I would say most of the time we are around 98% capacity, meaning that we're full all the time. We also have a waiting list. So, someone who's moving out of housing will give us notice, and, we'll begin to call the first five or 10 people who have been waiting on the list. Where we are able to help to fill that gap is we work closely with the Department of Social Services and also with Chautauqua Opportunities, meeting and working with the families that have been housed in motels. So that's how we're able to fill the gap. And then we're also able to help families that are victims of domestic violence. That's actually, part of, HUD public housing law. What is our response as a public housing authority? So our apartments range anywhere from 1 bedroom to 4 bedroom units. We don't have any what they call SROs, single room occupancies, which are more like studio apartments, and we don't have anything bigger than 5 bedrooms. Each of our developments, if you will, are located within 10-minute driving distance, so they're not far away from each other. We do have some units that are in a centralized location, so that those individuals and families are able to be walking distance from community resources and also from natural resources. I think, one of the primary obstacles to folks, achieving or working in that self-sufficiency continuum is the lack of transportation. So we have to be cognizant that people are walking, wherever they need to go. They're walking sometimes with, 2 or 3 children and infants in strollers. And so we try to house families in areas where they can access, county resources and their natural resources. All of our units come equipped with refrigerators and stoves. Some of the apartments may also have utilities included as part of their monthly rent. So we may have some units that include water. We have other units that include gas and electric. And it will depend on the development. We have, I don't know if folks are familiar with the Steger building, most commonly known as the high rise. So in this building, that's where I'm housed. We have 1 and a couple of 2-bedroom apartments. And so it will include, water, because we won't be able to ever have, separated water meters for 99 units. That's just how the building is built. So it depends on where the families are housed and what is included in the as part of their monthly rent. So the monthly rent in the housing authority is calculated by 2 things: household income, how much is coming into the household, and household composition. So it means that when we're looking at household income, it could be a combination of different incomes. Most income is used towards calculating the monthly rent. There are some exceptions. Consider a minor, who has a part-time job, or student, those kinds of things. But it's a formula. It's a complicated formula. And luckily, it all goes into a computer, and then it generates what that monthly rent is. I saw something in the chat, I'll look at it in a minute. And when we talk about the household composition, we also take into consideration, is this an individual? Is it 2 adults that are going to be living in this, in this unit? Is it, family with children? So that all plays into the mix of how much rent this person is paying, because it all depend on, what are the circumstances, and they're all individual. The smaller units contain washers and dryers on the main floor. So in the high rise, we have washers and dryers where our tenants have easy access to, where they're safe, where they can, go, at a time that's convenient with them, convenient for them to go downstairs and do their laundry. And then the family units, those do not come with washer and dryer, but they do have what we call the connections with the hookup, so that, you know, you're considering a larger family, making it feasible for them to do laundry at different times of the day and have it right there inside their unit. So it's making it easier for them. And most recently, we upgraded all of our security systems throughout all of our development. So we have cameras, and they run all the time, and we're able to, to look at, making sure that there's no crime, going on, no illegal activity going on in our buildings, in our area, and it's been very, very helpful. And then we also own 2 community rooms that are used for meetings and socializing. We do have sometimes the Office for the Aging will come in and do a workshop for us. We most recently had nutritionists come in and do nutrition and cooking classes, for everyone that is in our development, not just for the high rise. We just had hospice and palliative care come in and do a presentation for us. So we do have folks coming in. We had to back down a little bit because of COVID, but once COVID, we see some light at the end of the tunnel, and we'll be able to have more than 10 or 15 people together. One of the other things that we'll start up again is our congregate meals. We're part of the Meals on Wheels program. And so we have congregate, meals where people can socialize, come downstairs and have a breakfast packaged, prepackaged meal and a lunch. That's a very good program. Right now, we're just doing deliveries to those folks because of COVID, and hoping to get back into, where we can be together and talk about different things. Applications may be obtained different ways. You can Google the City of Dunkirk Housing Authority. There you'll see our phone number. That's one way to get an application. Just to call the number, and I'll send my information to everyone. And the other way will be by email to the Dunkirk Housing Authority at hotmail.com. We also send out, you can send us a quick email. Sometimes people don't have minutes on their phone, but they do have, an app where you can text or you can email. And so we'll be happy to send out applications. And then also we have a separate phone number where folks can text and ask for an application as well. Anyone that's interested in, getting more information, please feel free to contact me. You can just do a Google search for the City of Dunkirk Housing Authority. I'll be happy to answer your applications and get those applications out to families. Most recently, what we have been doing, I blame everything #COVID, is for folks to have the opportunity to, rather than to come into the building and bring us copies of documents that we're going to require as part of the application, they can simply take a picture and text it to us. And we'll be happy to, to download the picture and add it to the application, making it easy for everyone to apply for housing. As I said, right now, we do have a waiting list. Our longest waiting list is for 1 bedroom and 2 bedrooms. We do have a couple people on 3-bedroom waiting list, couple on the 4-bedroom waiting list. But we're able to, work through different scenarios. So please feel free, to call me. We do have, every housing authority has what they call admissions for continued occupancy. And through that, we can work through different things and say, how can we house this family and still follow HUD regulations? And so we come up with a particular, any type of emergency situation, please feel free to call me directly and I'll see what we can work on. So I'm going to try to get into the chat room. I don't know how to do that right now and look at everybody's messages. Mary, I can't hear you. Are you muted?
Okay, I'll give the questions to you. Is there a state residence requirement, or can someone move here and apply for that housing?
Typically what happens is anyone can apply and get on the waiting list. Now, there are some requirements that require the housing authority to house members in our community first, but anyone can get on the waiting list. And so, what happens there, let's say I have a 3-bedroom apartment coming up and there's no one on the waiting list, we're allowed to go outside of our the Dunkirk jurisdiction and see if we can house that family. So certainly, yes, anyone and everyone is encouraged to apply and at least get on the waiting list, because things change. COVID has taught us that, fast and furious. So things change. So the answer is yes, anyone can apply and get on the waiting list. Yes.
Okay, there's another question. I think it says, how can you be removed from public housing or kicked out? What are some of the criteria for
breaking the lease? Breaking the lease. We have a it's a legal document, and there's the different requirements that the tenant has to follow, different regulations. I would say, paying their rent, on time. We also have, noise ordinance, that kinds of stuff. You have an apartment where the police is there on a frequent basis. That's disturbing the peace of the neighborhood. Let's say we have a vehicle that doesn't have, license plates, is not registered. Certainly, any type of criminal activity will be grounds for an eviction. But what the housing authority does on our end is we issue what we call a notice of good cause, which states this is the rule or the regulation that you broke, and then we cite the regulation, and then that goes over to our attorney, and then our attorney brings those cases in front of the judge. But for sure, it would be any type of criminal activity. That's number one, in non-payment of rent.
There's a couple questions about your community rooms. One is, could the league come in to the community room to provide election information and try to get out the vote? Who would we contact for that if that's available?
Yes, we would like that very much, and that would come to me. That would be directly to me, because in the housing authority we also have a quarterly newsletter, and so the League of Women Voters is interested in coming out. I'd like to get that into the newsletter so that folks know the date and the times when you're going to be here, and then we could also do some marketing for you. Say, hey, did you know the League of Women Voters is coming over? Why don't you come downstairs and talk and have some coffee, or something like that. So I'd like to get it, with ample notification, because the newsletter only goes out quarterly, and so we'll miss.
Okay.
I'd like to have a bigger and better opportunity to get our tenants there, and that would be the way to do it. Directly contact me.
When is the next quarterly publication?
April 1st.
Oh, okay. All right.
So if you'd like to get something in there, Mary, I think I also put in the chat room if we could share email addresses. I'm sure other folks would like to come over and do other things in our community room and meet our tenants. And so you have my email address. If you just if you email me date and time, I'll be happy to get that in the newsletter. Considering our tenants are like to do things during the daytime, So that would be that would be a good time, or early afternoon would be, would be even better. So we know we can get more people there.
Some of us
Whatever.
are tired, so that's not too big a problem.
Great.
I saw equality bill Jessica mentioned to push forward. Are there any other bills or ways League of Women Voters can help with legislation, writing our legislators? Are there bills that Josiah or Elizabeth that you could tell us about that we could look into supporting?
Well,
And
the bill that Jessica mentioned is a federal bill, and so that's definitely on the federal level one that to look at. I could say thankfully that in the state of New York, our laws are more progressive than the federal government in general in terms of fair housing. So many of those things that Jessica mentioned in the city of Chicago are true across the state of New York, including discrimination based on sexual orientation or gender identity. So in a sense, I think many of those things that are being looked at the federal level have already passed at the state level, and we're grateful for that.
Oh, okay. All right.
Thank you. And we're highly regulated, and so that's why, when it comes down to, to applying, I encourage everyone and anyone who's looking for, housing, for safe, stable, and affordable housing, to submit an application. And then, when there's an apartment available based on, the unit size, then we're able to call that person, talk to that person, and see, and hopefully they're still interested. But we're highly regulated, as Josiah stated. There's many regulations that we have to abide by, and HUD has many systems in place to make sure that that we're fair and there's equity among applicants.
I have a question. I live in a little street in Fredonia, and at this present time, we unfortunately had some older people pass away, and there's been this one house that has been sitting for years and just unoccupied. I guess the bank owns it. I mean, is there any organization that like Jimmy Carter's, which one is that? Habitat for Humanity can take over these houses? I mean, I know this is off topic, but it's just something that really bothers me, that these houses that are pretty nice houses just sit empty for so long. It's crazy.
I think the organization that does the closest to that is the Chautauqua County Land Bank, and they do try to pick up vacant properties, which they can work with developers to rehab and then get them back into the marketplace. I don't know if this is a vacant property at this time or somebody living there.
In this case, I think a bank owns it, but it's just sitting there. It's not really vacant, but nobody's been in it. And the bank, I don't know, that just seems to me just a waste of a nice piece of property. So the land bank, do they when they rehab these houses, I've seen a couple examples of that in Fredonia. Do they really sell them for, market price, or do they kind of try and make a big profit? Do you know those answers?
I think they have a couple different approaches depending on the property. I don't know that they make a big profit on any of them. I know they take a loss on some of them. They try to cover their costs with different properties so that they can have a sustainable model.
Judy, you're okay.
I just wanted to, we don't have this program anymore, but I'm very, very advocating to have it returned. It's Youth Build. And that's exactly what Youth Build did, Mary. They would take an old house and then they would rehab it with kids learning basic construction skills, electric, plumbing, basic. I mean, so that you could get a job in construction. And then when they were done with this house, they would sell it to a low income family. It was, in my opinion, it was one of the best programs we had for youth here, and everyone benefited from it. I don't know how we can get that back, but I've been working with I've been talking to someone that works at the city of Dunkirk, because we really need this program back, in my opinion, to teach kids basic skills so that they could instantly get a job in construction.
Well, thank you.
Good pay.
Okay.
So that would be something we could work on, advocate to bring youth build back to this county.
Okay. You'll have to fill us in. Great, thanks. Okay, any other questions? We're getting near the hour, so or we are over the hour, so I like to try and keep it to, you know, the time frame. Sorry, Jessica was the one who was gabby. Yes, Elizabeth.
It was great. It was good information that Jessica shared. No, I'm still a new director and I'm still learning as well. So it's good information. Thank you.
Great. Well, thanks to the both of you, and excellent presentations. We appreciate it. As long as there are no questions, I would like Gail to stay on, because I got to tell her something about the presentation. If she would just stay on a minute.